The slap echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. Every inmate froze. An elderly black man, Mr. Harris, staggered backward, one hand on the wall, trying to stay on his feet as the bully, Knox, laughed in his face. "Old man, you don't belong here," Knox sneered. "And nobody here's gonna protect you." To everyone else, Mr. Harris looked harmless. A fragile inmate with trembling hands and fading eyesight. A man who kept to himself. A man who never fought back. What none of them knew was that someone was watching. Someone who had been waiting for Knox to cross the line. Because just 20 feet away, behind a reinforced glass window, a young guard's knuckles turned white around his radio. Officer Malik Harris, the old man's son. The one person his father never wanted to burden with the truth. And when he saw Knox raise his hand again, the calm, polite guard the prisoners knew disappeared. What happened in the next 3 minutes would become the most talked-about incident in that prison's history, and nothing would ever be the same again. Stay with me until the end, because what Knox learned about the old man and who he really was to that guard shocked the entire prison. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning shift at Riverside Correctional Facility had started like any other. The air was thick with disinfectant and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that never seemed to work quite right. It was the kind of place where hope went to die, where men counted down days in concrete cells and tried to remember what freedom felt like. For most of the guards, it was just another paycheck, another day of managing the forgotten and the dangerous. But for Officer Malik Harris, it was something entirely different. It was where his worst nightmare had become his daily reality. Malik had been working at Riverside for 3 years. At 28, he was young for a corrections officer, but he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from growing up in neighborhoods where respect wasn't given. It was earned. His uniform was always pressed, his badge polished, and his demeanor professional. The inmates knew him as fair but firm, a guard who didn't look for trouble but wouldn't back down from it either. What they didn't know was that every morning when Malik walked through those gates, his heart broke a little more. 2 months earlier, his father had been sentenced to 18 months for a crime that still made Malik's stomach turn: financial fraud. The old man had been desperate, caring for Malik's grandmother who was dying of cancer, and he'd made choices that destroyed everything. The legal fees had drained their savings, the shame had torn their family apart, and now, the man who had taught Malik about integrity and honor was wearing prison orange in the same facility where his son worked. The irony was suffocating. Malik had requested a transfer the moment he learned where his father would be housed. The warden had denied it. Budget cuts meant they were understaffed, and Malik was one of their most reliable officers. Besides, the warden had said with a dismissive wave, what were the chances they'd even cross paths in a facility housing over 2,000 inmates? The chances, as it turned out, were 100%. From the day his father arrived, Malik had watched from the shadows. He'd seen the old man struggle to adapt to prison life, seen him try to make himself invisible, seen him age 10 years in 2 months. And he'd also seen Knox start circling like a predator who'd found wounded prey. Tommy Knox was everything wrong with the prison system wrapped up in 240 pounds of muscle and malice. He was serving his 3rd stint for armed robbery, and each time he came back, he was more dangerous than before. Knox had built his reputation on violence and intimidation. He ran a small but vicious crew that controlled the laundry detail, and he used that position to squeeze protection money from the weaker inmates. Knox was the kind of predator who could smell vulnerability from across the yard, and when 72-year-old Jerome Harris had shuffled through those gates, Knox had practically licked his lips. The harassment had started small: a shoulder check in the hallway, food knocked off his tray in the cafeteria, whispered threats during count time. Malik had watched it all through security cameras, and during his rounds, his fists clenching every time he saw his father flinch or look away. But Jerome Harris had made Malik promise something before he'd been sentenced. In a conversation that had left both men in tears, the old man had begged his son to stay away, to let him serve his time without interference. "You've got a good job, a good reputation," Jerome had whispered, his voice breaking. "I won't let my mistakes destroy your future, too. If anyone finds out we're related, it'll ruin everything for you. Promise me, son. Promise me you'll stay out of it." Malik had promised, and for 2 months he'd kept that promise even as it killed him inside. But Knox didn't know when to stop. He never did. The incident that would change everything happened during the afternoon rec period. Malik was stationed in the observation booth overlooking the common area, a position that gave him a clear view of most of the floor. He'd specifically requested this assignment because it allowed him to keep an eye on his father without being obvious about it. Jerome Harris was sitting alone at a table near the corner, reading a worn paperback book he'd checked out from the prison library. At his age, with his deteriorating eyesight, reading was one of the few activities that still brought him peace. He'd found a quiet spot away from the television area where the younger inmates gathered, away from the wait stations where Knox's crew held court. He thought he was safe. Knox had been watching him for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. The big man had been losing respect among some of the inmates lately. A new crew from the east side of the city had arrived, and they weren't automatically falling in line with Knox's authority. He needed to make a statement, needed to remind everyone why they should fear him. The old man reading alone in the corner looked like the perfect victim. Knox pushed himself up from the bench where he'd been holding court with his lieutenants. He was a massive man, 6 feet 4 inches of prison-hardened muscle, with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of his violent life. His bald head gleamed under the harsh institutional lighting, and his cold gray eyes held the dead stare of a man who'd long ago stopped caring about consequences. His crew watched as he walked across the common area with the lazy confidence of an apex predator. Other inmates noticed too, conversations dying as they sensed something about to happen. The smart ones started moving away, not wanting to be caught up in whatever Knox was planning. Jerome Harris didn't notice any of it. His vision had been failing for months, and his hearing wasn't what it used to be. He was lost in his book, trying to escape into a world that didn't have concrete walls and steel bars. He didn't look up until Knox's shadow fell across his table. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Knox's voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "Old man thinks he can just sit here all peaceful like he owns the place." Jerome looked up slowly, squinting through his thick glasses. His hands, already showing the tremor of age and stress, began to shake a little more. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not bothering anyone?" Knox laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Old man, your whole existence here bothers me. You think this is some kind of retirement home? You think you can just cruise through your time while real men do hard time?" From the observation booth 20 feet away, Malik's blood turned to ice. He could see where this was heading, could see the cruel anticipation on Knox's face. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but he stopped himself. Getting involved would raise questions. Getting involved would expose the secret he'd promised to keep. But watching his father get terrorized was tearing him apart. Knox leaned down, placing both hands on the small table. The book in Jerome's hands was shaking now, the pages rustling like autumn leaves. "See, old man, this place has rules, and one of those rules is that everyone pays their dues. Everyone contributes to the system. And you've been freeloading." The common area had gone completely quiet now. Even the television had been turned down. This was the kind of moment that could define the next few months of prison hierarchy. And everyone knew it. Knew it. Jerome's voice was steady but barely audible. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to serve my time quietly." Knox's grin widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of neglect. "Quietly? See, that's the problem, old man. Quiet don't pay the bills in here. Quiet don't keep you safe. The big man reached down and flicked the book out of Jerome's hands. The paperback hit the floor with a soft thud, its pages splaying open. Several inmates nearby winced at the casual cruelty of the gesture. You know what I think? Knox continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone could hear. I think you're one of those white-collar types who thinks he's better than the rest of us, thinks his crime was cleaner somehow. Well, let me tell you something, Grandpa. In here, we're all the same, and everyone pays their share. Jerome bent slowly to retrieve his book, his arthritic joints protesting with each movement. As his fingers closed around the worn cover, Knox's boot came down hard on his wrist, pinning his hand to the floor. The old man gasped, more from shock than pain, but the sound cut through Malik like a blade. In the observation booth, the young guard's breathing became shallow and rapid. His training told him to call for backup, to follow protocol, but his heart was screaming something entirely different. Let me go, please, Jerome whispered, trying to pull his hand free. The pressure from Knox's boot was cutting off circulation, and his fingers were already starting to turn purple. Please, Knox mocked, pressing down harder. Did you say please to your victims when you were stealing their money, old man? Did you think about their grandparents when you were running your little scam? The accusation hit Jerome like a physical blow. His crime hadn't been a scam in the traditional sense, but Knox didn't care about details. To him, financial fraud was financial fraud, and it gave him all the justification he needed for what came next. Knox lifted his boot and grabbed Jerome by the front of his orange jumpsuit, hauling the frail man to his feet with one powerful motion. The fabric stretched and strained under the force, and Jerome's glasses slipped down his nose. Here's how it works, Pops, Knox said, his face inches from Jerome's. His breath smelled of cigarettes and instant coffee. You've got a choice. You can pay me $50 a week for protection, or you can learn why everyone else pays me $50 a week for protection. $50 was impossible. Jerome's commissary account barely had $20, money that Malik had been secretly depositing to ensure his father could buy basic necessities like soap and decent coffee. The old man's Social Security checks were going to pay restitution to his victims, leaving him with almost nothing. I don't have that kind of money, Jerome said, his voice breaking slightly. I can barely afford toothpaste. Knox's expression darkened. This wasn't the response he'd been expecting. Most inmates faced with his intimidation either paid up immediately or cowered and begged. Jerome's quiet dignity, even in his fear, was somehow making Knox look less powerful in front of his audience. You don't have the money? Knox's voice rose dangerously. Then maybe you need a reminder of what happens to people who don't have the money. That's when he drew back his massive hand and struck. The slap echoed through the common area like a thunderclap. Jerome's head snapped to the side, his glasses flying off and skittering across the polished concrete floor. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, his elderly legs unable to maintain balance. He crashed into a nearby table, sending plastic chairs scattering, before finally hitting the ground hard. For a moment, the only sound in the entire common area was Jerome's labored breathing as he tried to push himself up on his elbows. A thin line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, where his teeth had cut his lip. Knox stood over him, chest heaving with adrenaline and satisfaction. This was what he lived for, these moments of absolute dominance when everyone else was reminded of their place in the food chain. Stay down, old man, Knox snarled. Maybe now you'll remember who runs things around here. But Jerome Harris was made of tougher stuff than Knox had calculated. The old man had grown up in Detroit during the 60s, had faced down racist cops and corporate executives who thought they could intimidate him. He'd built a successful accounting practice from nothing, had raised a son who became everything he'd dreamed of. One mistake, one desperate attempt to save his dying mother, had brought him here, but it hadn't broken his spirit. Slowly, painfully, Jerome began to push himself to his feet. Knox's face flushed red with fury. The old man was supposed to stay down, was supposed to grovel and beg for mercy, Instead, he was getting up, his movements deliberate and dignified, despite the pain. "I said stay down!" Knox roared, drawing back his hand for another strike. That's when Malik Harris finally moved. The observation booth door exploded open with a bang that made every inmate jump. Officer Malik Harris stepped into the common area like a force of nature, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something cold and dangerous. His hand rested on his radio, but his eyes were locked on Knox with an intensity that made the big man take an involuntary step backward. "That's enough." Malik's voice cut through the tension like a knife. It wasn't shouted, but it carried with absolute authority that every inmate recognized. This wasn't the polite, professional guard they knew. This was someone else entirely. Knox turned to face him, confusion flickering across his features. In 3 years, he'd never seen Officer Harris lose his cool. The young guard was known for being fair but distant, someone who did his job without getting personally involved. "This ain't your business, Harris," Knox said, though some of the bluster had gone out of his voice. Just a little disagreement between inmates. Malik took 3 measured steps into the common area, and with each step, his presence seemed to fill more space. The other inmates pressed themselves against the walls, sensing that something was about to happen that would be talked about for years. "I said that's enough," Malik repeated, his voice even quieter now, but somehow more menacing. "Step away from him. Now." Knox glanced around the room, suddenly aware that dozens of eyes were watching this confrontation. His reputation was on the line. If he backed down from a guard, especially one who looked barely older than some of the inmates, his authority would crumble. "Or what?" Knox challenged, puffing out his chest. "You gonna write me up? Put me in the hole? I've been in solitary before, boy. It don't scare me." The word boy hung in the air like a lit match near gasoline. Several inmates drew in sharp breaths, recognizing that Knox had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Malik's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. His shoulders squared, his weight shifted to the balls of his feet, and his hands moved away from his belt. In that moment, he looked less like a corrections officer and more like what he'd been before taking this job. A young man who'd grown up fighting for respect in neighborhoods where weakness was a death sentence. "What did you just call me?" Malik's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "Me?" Malik's voice was barely, but it carried to above silent room every corner of the suddenly a whisper now. Knox realized his mistake the moment the word left his lips. The entire common area seemed to hold its breath as Officer Harris took another step forward, and for the first time in years, Tommy Knox felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: genuine fear. The transformation in Malik was complete now. Gone was the professional demeanor, the by-the-book approach that had defined his 3 years at Riverside. What stood before Knox was someone entirely different, someone who had been pushed past a breaking point that had been building for 2 months of watching his father suffer in silence. Knox tried to recover, forcing his trademark sneer back onto his face. "Look, Harris, I don't know what's got you all worked up, but this is between me and the old man. Why don't I just what?" Malik interrupted, his voice cutting through Knox's bluster like a blade. "Turn around and pretend I didn't see you assault an elderly inmate? Pretend I didn't hear you threaten him? Is that what you think I should do?" The other inmates were pressed against the walls now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In all their years inside, none of them had ever seen a guard this angry, this personal about anything. Most corrections officers maintained their distance, treating inmates like inventory to be managed rather than human beings to be protected. But there was something different about the way Officer Harris was looking at Jerome. Something that made a few of the more observant inmates start to wonder. Knox's crew had moved closer, flanking their leader in a show of support, but even they seemed uncertain. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went. Guards were supposed to call for backup, file reports, follow procedures. They weren't supposed to look like they were about to tear someone's head off. You need to check yourself, Harris, Knox said, trying to reassert his authority. I got rights in here. You can't just… Rights? Malek's laugh was harsh and bitter. You want to talk about rights? What about his rights? He gestured toward Jerome, who was still on the ground, blood trickling from his split lip. What about his right not to be assaulted by a coward who picks on people 3 times smaller than him? Knox's face flushed red. Being called a coward in front of his crew, in front of half the common area, was an insult he couldn't let stand. His massive hands clenched into fists, and he took a step toward Malik. You better watch your mouth, boy, Knox growled. Guard uniform don't make you bulletproof in here. That was the final straw. What happened next would be replayed in the minds of every witness for years to come. Malik didn't reach for his radio. He didn't call for backup. He didn't follow a single protocol in the corrections officer handbook. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He unclipped his radio and set it carefully on a nearby table. Then he removed his keys, his pepper spray, and his baton, placing each item with deliberate precision. The metallic clinks echoed in the absolute silence of the common area. You think this uniform is what makes me dangerous? Malik asked quietly, his voice steady as steel. Let me show you what makes me dangerous. Knox's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. The guard was stripping himself of his official authority, leveling the playing field in a way that was both terrifying and impossible to ignore. The inmates around the room began to murmur, a low buzz of excitement and disbelief. This was the kind of moment that became legend in prison, the kind of story that would be told and retold until it took on mythical proportions. Knox looked around desperately, suddenly aware that his carefully constructed reputation was crumbling. His crew was watching, waiting to see if their leader would back down from a challenge issued by a guard who had just voluntarily given up every advantage his position provided. You crazy, Harris, Knox said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You can't do this. They'll fire you, press charges. You'll lose everything. Malik's smile was cold as winter. Some things are more important than a job. The words hit Jerome like a physical blow. His son was about to throw away everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, all because of a promise he'd made to stay away. The old man struggled to his feet, his vision blurry without his glasses, but his voice clear and strong. Officer Harris, Jerome called out, using the formal address they'd maintained for 2 months. Don't do this. I'm not worth it. For the first time since entering the common area, Malik looked at his father directly. Their eyes met across the 20 feet that separated them, and in that moment, 2 months of careful pretense crumbled away. Yes, you are, Malik said simply, and everyone in the room heard the emotion that had been carefully hidden beneath his professional facade. Knox was starting to understand that something bigger was happening here, something that went beyond a guard having a bad day. The way Harris looked at the old man, the way he'd said those 3 words, it all pointed to a connection that Knox hadn't seen before. Wait a minute, Knox said slowly, his predator's instincts picking up on the undercurrent of emotion in the room. Wait just a damn minute. You two know each other, don't you? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Several inmates leaned forward, suddenly realizing that they might be witnessing something even more significant than a guard losing his temper. Malik said nothing, but his silence was answer enough for Knox, who began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass. Well, I'll be damned, Knox said, his confidence returning as he sensed an opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. Harris and the old man got history. That's why you're so worked up, ain't it? What is he? Your snitch? Your informant? He's my father. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread to every corner of the common area. Inmates who had been pressed against the walls suddenly straightened, their eyes wide with shock and understanding. Knox's mouth fell open. In all his years inside, through all the violence and betrayal he'd witnessed, this was something he'd never seen. A corrections officer, whose own father was an inmate in the same facility. The irony was so bitter, so perfectly tragic, that even Knox was momentarily speechless, but only momentarily. A slow, cruel smile spread across Knox's face as he realized the magnitude of what he'd just learned. This wasn't just about intimidating an old man anymore. This was about power, leverage, and the kind of information that could reshape the entire dynamic of the prison. "Your daddy," Knox said, savoring each word like fine wine. "Officer Harris's daddy is in here with the rest of us criminals. How about that?" Jerome closed his eyes, knowing that the secret they'd fought so hard to protect was now public knowledge. In a place where information was currency and weakness was exploited without mercy, this revelation would change everything for both of them. Malik felt the weight of every stare in the room, felt the shift in dynamics that Knox's words had created. But instead of the shame or fear he might have expected, he felt something else entirely: relief. The burden of secrecy, the constant stress of maintaining their charade, the agony of watching his father suffer while pretending not to care. It was all finally over. "That's right," Malik said, his voice carrying to every corner of the common area. "That's my father, the man you just assaulted, the man you threatened, the man you demanded money from, knowing he barely has enough for basic necessities." Knox's grin widened. "This just keeps getting better. Wonder what the warden's gonna think about this little family reunion. Wonder what the other guards are gonna say when they find out one of their own has got family on the inside." But Malik wasn't backing down. If anything, the revelation seemed to have strengthened his resolve. "You want to know what I think about every single day, Knox? I think about how a man who spent 40 years as a respected accountant, who put himself through college working 3 jobs, who built a business from nothing and employed dozens of people in his community, ended up in here because he made one desperate mistake trying to save his dying mother." The words poured out of Malik like water through a broken dam. 2 months of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "I think about how he sold everything he owned to try to make restitution to the people he hurt. I think about how he insisted on pleading guilty even when his lawyer said he could beat the charges. I think about how he asked me to stay away, to protect my career, because even in here, even facing this, he was still trying to take care of me." Jerome was weeping now, quiet tears streaming down his bruised face. The son he'd raised to be strong and principled was laying his heart bare in front of the most dangerous predators in the system, all to defend his honor. Knox, however, saw only opportunity. "That's real touching, Harris. But here's what I think about every day. How much easier my life just got. See, now I don't just have a scared old man to squeeze money from. Now I got leverage on a guard. And that, my friend, is worth a whole lot more than $50 a week." The threat was clear, and everyone in the room understood its implications. Knox wasn't just talking about extorting Jerome anymore. He was talking about using their relationship to corrupt Malik, to turn him into another tool in Knox's criminal enterprise. Malik's response was swift and decisive. He took 2 quick steps forward, closing the distance between himself and Knox before the bigger man could react. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the inmates had to strain to hear it, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. "Let me explain something to you, Tommy," Malik said, using Knox's first name for the first time, stripping away the last pretense of professional distance. "You seem to think you've gained some kind of advantage here. You seem to think knowing about my father gives you power over me, but you've got it backwards." Knox tried to step back, but Malik matched his movement, staying close enough that the bigger man could feel his breath. "See, before today, I had to follow rules. I had to be professional. I had to treat you like any other inmate with rights and dignity and due process. But you just changed all that. You made this personal. And when things get personal, Tommy, the rules change too." Knox's face went through a series of expressions as Malik's words sank in. First confusion, then realization, and finally something that looked almost like fear. The big man had built his reputation on reading people, on knowing exactly how far he could push before someone broke. But he was looking at Officer Harris now and seeing something he'd never encountered before. A man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The common area had become a pressure cooker. Every inmate pressed against the walls could feel the tension building to a breaking point. Some of the older convicts, men who'd seen decades of prison violence, were quietly moving toward the exits. They recognized the signs of something about to explode. Knox's crew exchanged nervous glances. Their leader's bravado was starting to crack, and they could see it. Martinez, Knox's second-in-command, took a half-step forward as if to intervene, but a sharp look from Knox stopped him cold. "You think you scare me, Harris?" Knox said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You think taking off that uniform changes anything? I've been handling punks like you since before you could tie your shoes." Malik's smile was arctic. "Then handle me, Tommy. Right here, right now. No backup, no weapons, no authority. Just you and me and everything you've got coming." The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Knox looked around the room, seeing dozens of faces watching his every move. His reputation, built over years of calculated violence and intimidation, was balanced on a knife's edge. If he backed down now, he'd never recover. But something in Harris's eyes told him that accepting the challenge might be the last mistake he ever made. What happened next became the stuff of prison legend. Knox, faced with a choice between his reputation and his safety, made the only decision a man like him could make. He swung first, but Malik was ready. The fight lasted exactly 97 seconds, witnessed by 43 inmates who would tell the story for decades to come. When the dust settled, Knox was on the ground, his reign of terror over. Malik helped his father to his feet, and for the first time in 2 months, Jerome Harris stood tall in that place. The old man's dignity, protected by his son's courage, had been restored. Within a week, Knox was transferred to another facility. The warden, reviewing the security footage, quietly buried the incident report. Some secrets, he decided, were worth keeping. Malik kept his job, but more importantly, he kept his father's respect. And Jerome? He served the rest of his sentence in peace, knowing that sometimes love means breaking every rule that matters. The other inmates learned something that day too. They learned that family doesn't end at the prison gates, and that a father's love can inspire a son to move mountains, even mountains made of concrete and steel.